Hi everyone, this is Dr. Stringer, and we are back talking about drugs and crime this week. So, for those of you that haven't read the chapter yet, I wanted to bring your attention to some of these quotes at the beginning of the chapter on page 59. I find the second one to be the most interesting, so if you haven't read that, obviously, go back and look at that. But it says, I have almost daily experience with users of marijuana for the reason that when they are addicted, to the use, they become very violent, especially when they become angry and will attack an officer. I have also noted that when under the influence, they have abnormal strength, and that it will take several men to handle one man. Marijuana produces a lust for blood. This is Bonnie and Whitebread quoting a police officer in 1974 that marijuana users have a lust for blood. And so I thought that was interesting because we're talking about kind of this drugs and crime relationship today. And, that is kind of a common theme that people often think that, well, someone's using drugs, so they must be violent and they're going to go and commit crimes. And so this is one of the big things that we're going to talk about in this class and obviously in this lecture is to talk about, does drug use really cause people to commit crimes? And we'll talk about that in some more detail as we move forward. So with that, I will go ahead and start getting into a little bit more of the details here. Um, since the early 20th century, anti-drug laws and stuff like that have been kind of originated around the concern that, crime was a result of drug abuse. And a lot of politicians have said this, and there's a lot of rhetoric around it. The scientific evidence is not very conclusive, however, but, that doesn't seem to stop people from saying it. Um, so, is there a direct link between illegal drug use and crime? Um, no, it's very complicated, as you'll see, as I'll talk about. And one of the biggest criticisms of saying that drug use causes crime is this idea of is there correlation versus causation. Um, you'll probably hear about this, hopefully, when you take research methods. If you haven't taken research methods yet, if you've already taken research methods, you probably know that just because something is correlated doesn't necessarily mean that one thing causes the other, right? So you could very easily have um, a situation where drug use actually causes um, crime, as is hypothesized by a lot of the anti-drug legislation. There could also be a situation where someone's crime causes them to commit drug or to engage in drug use. Um, and so that's a possibility. That means that the causality is actually backwards from what the political rhetoric would have us believe. There's also something known as what is called a spurious effect, meaning that there's some other third factor that causes both drug use and crime that has nothing to do with drug use and crime. For instance, socioeconomic status. If you're poor, you're probably more likely to engage in drug use and more likely to engage in crime. And so that might be causing both of these things to happen. And so the drug use isn't causing the crime isn't causing the drug use. The fact that you're poor might be, the causal factor there. One of the big classic example for spuriousness in criminal justice, for those of you that don't know, is the idea that ice cream sales are related to crime. And so people, if they looked at that, they would say, well, ice cream sales are correlated with crime, right? And so, but it would be stupid to say that ice cream causes people to commit crimes, right? I think most of you would agree that that's a silly notion to come up with. However, they are correlated, so you don't want to make that assumption. And actually, what the idea is that once you control for the time of year, you find that it's actually the time of year that is causing this. That it's a spurious effect of the time of year, because in the summertime there are more ice cream sales, obviously, right? You don't really see that much ice cream being sold during the wintertime, and it just so happens that during the summertime there's actually more crime. And so it's actually the time of year that is causing the spike in ice cream sales and in the spike in crime. So there's a little knowledge for you for those of you that haven't taken research methods. You can go and impress your research methods professor with that. But anyway, um, so drug use among offenders. There's a general overview of the drug problem in America, and a lot of the research does say that it varies across demographics, some socio-demographic status, different contexts, and things like that. And so one of the ways that we've been tracking this is what is known as the ATOM data, the Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring Program. And they essentially test people who are arrested for drugs. And in 2011, they found that 64 to 81% of the people that were arrested were positive for some sort of illegal drug. So if you look at just that, you might think, wow, it does sound like there's a pretty strong uh, excuse me, correlation at least between drug use and crime. Now, you might actually think about it even deeper and think about, well, actually using the drugs and being in possession of drugs is actually a crime. So it could very well be that a good percentage of these people were actually arrested for drug crimes or drug possession, and it wouldn't probably come to much of a surprise that they were using drugs too, right? And they tested positive. So that's one of the problems with this drug use and crime relationship is that drugs in and of itself are a crime. And so if you look at data that shows you this, then you'll say, well, it's a crime to possess cocaine. And so if you're using cocaine, then isn't it also drug use, but it's also a crime in and of itself, right? So it kind of creates this tautology. I think your textbook talks about that a little bit. That you can't really separate these things out. Oops, I'm clicking on things here. Anyway, so the FBI has some more statistics, and I think I've mentioned this before. In 2012, there were 1.5 million arrests for drug law violations. I think I've mentioned this to you earlier on in the class, but we arrest more people in this country for drug offenses than we do anything else. It is the number one arrest, and we incarcerate a lot of people for it too. And so here you look at 2012, 82% of arrests are for drug possession. Another 42% of these are for just simple marijuana possession. I think I mentioned earlier in the class that a lot of the arrests for drug possession and drug offenses are for marijuana. So that's kind of part of why, we don't see this big push to make things illegal. And then about only 16% of those arrests are for kind of what we would consider to be the harder drugs, the marijuana, or I'm sorry, yeah, I spoke there, the cocaines and the heroin. Sorry, I was flashing back to the whole drug scheduling lecture from last time. Anyway, so moving forward, and your textbook talks a little bit about drug use in correctional populations, and so I'll kind of go through that a little bit briefly. We'll touch on this more when we get to um, talking about corrections after, and I think that's a couple chapters from now. I want to say chapter 8 off the top of my head, so that we'll get to that a little bit down the road. But there is a good amount of drug use in prisons, jails, probation, parole, in these institutions, which some of you may have heard from the past that it's kind of easier to get drugs in prison than it is outside, which is actually true in many cases. And more than 80% of state prison inmates have indications of drug or alcohol abuse. Um, they do actually make alcohol in the prisons. I think they call it hooch, and it's made in a toilet usually. So if you wanted to drink that, then I guess that's up to you. But I guess if you're in prison, you might be pretty desperate. Um, but anyway, and then oftentimes the drugs getting into the prisons are usually brought in either snuck in somehow or they're brought in by the guards themselves. So take what you want for that, but don't think that just because someone's going to jail or prison, they're going to be clean. I had this debate with some friends years ago who a friend that we went to high school with was using drugs, and they're like, we need to call the police on him and have him put in prison so he can get his act together and get cleaned up. And I tried to explain to them that no, that's not going to help his situation. It's probably just going to make it worse because they very rarely will get rehabilitation and stuff like that, but they still have access to drugs. Um, so we'll talk about that later. But anyway, so female versus male inmates. There's a little bit of a difference there. About 53% and 60% of female inmates meet the requirements for drug abuse dependence while they're incarcerated. But drug abuse is 10 times greater among female inmates and 4 times greater among male inmates compared to the general population. So females tend to abuse drugs a little bit more when they're incarcerated than men do. Um, Anyway, drug abuse is common among inmates regardless of the offense. You look at this, so it doesn't really matter what you're incarcerated for. If you look at the property offenses and the drug offenses, it's almost the same. So if you're incarcerated for one of these, even public order offenders and violent criminals, it seems to be quite common. That they will use drugs while they're incarcerated. Of course, it's associated with extensive criminal history. And that's one of the things to think about too when we think about the drug and crime relationship. You know, if you're willing to go out there and rob banks or steal things or whatever, you're probably not going to have any hesitation to go and smoke a joint too, or sniff a line of cocaine while you're doing it, or afterwards, or beforehand, or whatever. Right? If you're that type of person, um, you're not going to think twice about it, so to speak, right? Usually, and so that's one of the things to think about too when you're thinking about, well, does drug use cause crime, or is it just that maybe criminals, part of the crimes that they commit is to use drugs, and then there's plenty of people out there that might use drugs and not commit any crimes. This drugs and crime relationship is very complicated. Um, and your textbook gives you a very good overview, I think, of this complexity. And I'll try to get into a little bit of it and give you my broad thoughts about it as well. Um, so illegal drug users are more likely to commit crimes than non-drug users. Like I said, if you are an illegal drug user, one of the problems is a lot of times people who are illegal drug users have a hard time holding down a job, especially if they're dependent on heroin and things like that. But they'll still need to find some way to sustain their addiction, right? And so there are some people that tend to turn to property crime in order to feed their addiction, so to speak. They might start stealing things. Um, but then again, like I just said a few minutes ago, those who commit crimes are also more likely to use drugs than those that do not commit crimes. So criminals are not going to have problems, you know, committing illegal acts regarding substances. If they'll break into your car in the middle of the night, then, like I said, they're not going to have a problem smoking a joint or sniffing a line or whatever afterwards. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it because of the drug use. They could be, but we don't know that for sure, right? And then, like I said, also, not all drug users will commit crimes. There's plenty of drug users out there that do not commit crimes, right? And there's an example that I had in a reading, and I posted it on D2L about this executive who uses heroin, and he's addicted to it. He uses it every day, as I recall. But he still keeps his job, and he doesn't commit any crimes. He's a functioning, what we would call a functioning user. So he continues to function. I think he just used. Actually, he might not have used on the weekdays. It might have just been the weekend. Sorry, it's been a while since I read that article. But that's posted in D2L for you, and I encourage you to read that because it's kind of interesting. And it's not a long journal article. I think it's from the New York Times, so it's a pretty short article to read. And I think it's really interesting. I think it might be in some of the. I'm trying to remember what module I put it in. But anyway, you'll find it in there if you want. If you can't find it, then email me. And so, as I talked about briefly earlier, there are three possible explanations for this drug crime connection: that crime causes drug use, that drug use causes crime, or that there's some other common factor that leads to increases in drug use and crime, some spurious effect, kind of like summertime with the ice cream and the crime example that I used earlier, right? So, in our case, one of the things that we often look at with drugs and crime is socioeconomic status, like I said. So, the key thing I think you'll want to remember is that this is a very complex relationship. It's not as simple as some people would have you believe, that it's like, oh, well, drug use clearly just causes crime, and we can just end the day with that. That's not the case. It's important to think about the community, social, environmental factors that play a role here. If you use drugs and you're rich, chances are you're not going to need to steal or commit any crimes to support your habit. If you're addicted to heroin and you need to use heroin every single day in order to prevent yourself from having withdrawal symptoms, and you're poor, then it is more likely that you might have to turn to some sort of property crime or start selling drugs or engage in prostitution or something like that in order to feed your habit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen in every single case. One of the things that I like to try to get students away from is this idea of determinism. That just because you use drugs, that automatically means that you're going to commit crimes, or just because you have used drugs or marijuana means that you're going to go on to using other drugs. Um, this is one of the things we get into with this criticisms of gateway theory, right? And I think I touched on that already. But anyway, you have to look at whether people engage in other deviant or antisocial behaviors, high risk peers or environments. If your friends use drugs, then it makes it more likely that you're going to use drugs. At the same time, if your friends are criminals, then it's more likely that you're going to be engaged in this, right? Um, and so I kind of touched on this already, but does the link between drugs and crime reflect the illegal status of the drugs? So if we made drugs legal, and there wasn't this tautology between the fact that, well, it's actually a crime to use drugs, so then how can we then talk about how there's a connection between drug use and crime when drug use is in fact a crime? But if we legalized it and eliminated that part, would there still be this link there? And I think that's a good question to think about because right now we can't really do that. But with seeing some of these changes in marijuana policies, I think that gives us the ability to do so and ability to analyze these things. We could also do it with looking at something like alcohol, which is one of the more prolific drugs, and it's actually legal to use, right? So to think about that. Um, Consequently, there is a pretty good amount of research that has shown that alcohol does tend to lead to violence. And so there is research that shows this because partly because it can rule out this tautology because it is actually legal, and then it does actually show that the one legal, mind-altering drug or intoxicating drug will actually lead to violence. Um, I don't know how you all feel about the idea of the quote from that I read at the beginning that marijuana makes people violent. I don't particularly agree with that. I've never seen anyone be violent when they were stoned before, but maybe you have. The only thing I've seen them tear up is your pantry and a box of Twinkies, maybe, or pizza. Um, anyway, funny story. When I was in college, there was a cookie delivery place, and they would deliver cookies at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I always wondered, I said, who wants cookies at 2 o'clock in the morning? And it's like, oh, I guess there could be some situations when people might want cookies at 2 o'clock in the morning. Um, but anyway, so theories explaining the drug crime connection. There's kind of been different theories across biology, sociology, and psychology. Eric Good, who actually he writes a book on drug use and society, but it's not the one that I used for this class because this class is supposed to be a little bit more criminal justice based than the other sociology class, Sociology 4200. So you might have used Eric Good's book for those of you that took Soci 4200 on drugs, alcohol, and society. And so you might be familiar with this if you've taken that class before. But anyway, so he gives three basic explanatory models. The first one being the enslavement model, that pretty much criminal behavior is the result of drug users becoming physically addicted or becoming a slave to the drug, right? They have to feed their addiction, and so in order to do that, they have to commit crimes like a heroin addict or something in order to have the money to go out and buy more drugs. And so then essentially they become a slave to the drug use. The predisposition model. The drug users were engaged in criminal behavior prior to initiating drug use. Think about maybe gang members might be a good example, right? So gang members might be, engaged in crime. But the gang members, part of being in a gang might involve drug use as well, right? And so, while one of the prime things is to go out and commit, crimes, there might be some drug use involved as well, even though that's just kind of a secondary factor. And so this kind of creates another risk factor, right? And then the intensification model. Um, this one I think is probably at least more generally applied to drug use in general um, than some of the others. Like if you look at predisposition, essentially saying, well, people are criminals, uh, and that applies to people that are already criminals prior to starting their drug use. And enslavement, I think you can see that with heroin use and the more addictive drugs. But other things, I don't think, the less addictive drugs you're going to become so much of a slave to, so to speak. However, I could see this intensification model being more broadly applied because drug use accelerates criminal behavior, right? Um, so, maybe I don't know, maybe you have a predisposition for perhaps being violent. I know that there were people that I went to college with that they like to go and fight, uh, and they didn't do it all the time, but they had a very short temper. And so maybe you have a short temper, and when you drink, that only makes that fuse even shorter, right? And most of you can probably identify with this because you've probably seen it to some extent, right? And so if you have a person that is kind of predisposed towards violence, and then they get drunk, then they might, be even more violent than they were before. And this, I'm using alcohol as an example, but this could apply to other things too. It could apply to PCP or meth or something like that. These other the downers, the heroin and stuff like that, they don't really make you violent, so to speak, right? So that you're going to be more in the enslavement model. It doesn't mean that you won't rob people or whatever in order to get drugs if you have to, but not as there's not the biological effect of making you more violent that you see more with stimulants, I think. Anyway, so drug use and property crime is kind of a big thing. And there are some drug users who commit property crime to support their habit, so to speak. I can remember one guy that comes to mind. He used to go to country clubs and he would rob people and steal their golf clubs. Golf clubs are very expensive, in case you don't know. And then he would take the golf clubs to the pawn shop and pawn them. And this is not like stealing a credit card or a gun or something like that. A gun has a serial number, and so do credit cards. And so if you steal those, it's kind of harder to do anything with it once you get it. The golf clubs don't have serial numbers; they don't have any of these things. So if you take it to the pawn shop, it's very hard to track that sort of thing. For those of you that don't know, when you sell a gun or pretty much anything to a pawn shop, they put it in a database with a descriptor and maybe a serial number and who sold it to them and these sorts of things. If they just put random golf clubs in there, it can be harder to track. But if they put a Glock 19 with serial number such and such, that's a little bit more challenging. Consequently, that guy did get caught eventually, so it wasn't the perfect crime, but I thought it was interesting for a drug user to come up with that idea. And if you think about it, people at a country club are probably happy to just give you your golf clubs and they'll be terrified and give them to you and go, here you go. But anyway, um, so oftentimes that you'll see other things that will happen is that illegal drug use is an expensive habit. So people will work for drug dealers. They'll receive pay in order to deliver drugs, to smuggle drugs. They'll engage in dealing themselves and things like that in order to support their habit. I think your textbook talks about Some people will engage in prostitution and things like that in order to support their habits as well. Um, and there's other criminal behavior that people may turn to. So this is interesting, and I'd like to talk about this Baltimore study. Drug users engaged in crime 255 days per year during periods of addiction. Okay, so 255 out of 365. There's still 100 days where they're not committing crimes, but okay. But then during non-addicted periods, so in a year where they weren't using drugs and they weren't addicted, they only committed crimes on 105 days. So this kind of supports that intensification model, right? During non-addicted periods, they didn't commit zero crime, but they did commit more than half as much, or half as much. So it was twice as much during periods of addiction. So this kind of supports the idea that maybe drug addiction intensifies the desire to commit crimes, but is not necessarily causing it. 38% of these were property crimes. And so, as I've talked about, property crime tends to be one of these things that drug users will use to support their habits, and the studies have shown that property crime rates tend to increase when drug users are in a period of heavy use because they have to support paying for that addiction, right? Um, and so some other research has shown that the drug use and property crime relationship even depends on the type of property crime, right? So there's some nuances even with that. And so prison inmates show that those incarcerated for property crimes are more likely to have recently been involved in drugs. 64% used drugs in the prior month, and 38.5 under the influence of drugs when the offense was committed. So you see that the drugs tend to vary in there, and so there was a high amount of people that were actually using drugs at least immediately prior to or during the offense, right? Um, I'm, if you commit a crime and you're under the influence, I venture to say you might be more likely to get caught because you might not be thinking as clearly and you might mess up, right? The smart criminals often aren't the ones that get caught. So there's that little tidbit of information. Drugs and violence. So one of the things to think about here is that the drug market in and of itself is violent. When you think about gangs dealing drugs and defending their turf, things like that. That's kind of getting at the idea that this whole drug market is violent. You think about back when we had prohibition and Al Capone was running around with the Tommy gun and everything. It was so much violence because alcohol was even more prolifically used than any other drug that we have, right? And so it created this entire black market. The mafia kind of took over a lot of things, and it created all of this violence, which is part of why they decided to repeal prohibition. But you still see these same things going on with drug markets and the drug cartels today, right? And so I think there's a good amount of literature and evidence that shows that the, the drug market itself does actually produce violence. So you could venture out to say that there is some sort of drug and crime relationship there, because there's a relationship between having an illegal drug market and the crime associated with that market, right? Drug dealers are known for getting robbed because people want drugs and they know that their drug dealer is going to have a lot of drugs on them that they can steal and probably a lot of cash too. And so people will rob drug dealers, but most drug dealers will learn from that pretty quickly, and then they'll start to carry a gun. And so then you have someone go and rob the drug dealer, then either the drug dealer gets shot or the drug dealer defends himself and shoots the person trying to rob them, which is causing more violence, right? And so there is some logic and some research to support that. So Goldstein has kind of a framework for this drug relationship to violent crime, and it's based into three kind of parts: the psychopharmacological model, that drugs and violence are strongly connected, and that certain drugs increase aggressive violent behavior. I think I've mentioned, this mainly revolves around stimulants and alcohol, so your PCP, your methamphetamine, your cocaine, crack, things like that. It's not so much going to have the same effect with your marijuanas and your heroines and other things like that, the downers. I think I've talked about that before. Um, so looking at the economic compulsive model, and this is the idea, which I've already talked about, that users need money to maintain their drug dependence, right? And so they're going to resort to criminal acts to support their addiction. Um, and increased agitation by the user may increase violence as well. If they're having trouble finding drugs, they might get more and more agitated as the withdrawal symptoms increase. And they get a little bit more desperate. So that can increase violence, not just property crime or stealing things. And then there's kind of the systemic model, which is what I'd already kind of talked about with the drug market. That it's inherently confrontational and exploitive. So there can be violence between the dealers, the traffickers, the users, and stuff like that. As there, you have these conflicts, and so you have that systemic violence that results from the market itself. Now, of course, the solution being that we'll just legalize it all, like Amsterdam and the Netherlands and all those areas, and then we can at least get rid of the systemic violence, right? Or at least reduce it pretty much. Um, so that's something to think about there. Anyway, so stimulant drugs and violence. I've already kind of touched on this, but stimulants have a strong correlation to violence. Cocaine being a big one. It's fast acting on the nervous system, triggers agitation, hyperactivity. There's a gender connection there, a positive relationship between male cocaine use and committing violence. The female usage was more so related to victimization rather than committing violent crimes, which is interesting. So male users of cocaine were more likely to commit violent crime. Female users are more likely to be the victims of the violent crime. Um, and then you can have aggressive personalities and risk-taking behaviors. These rates tend to be much higher among drug users than general population because if you think about it, drug use is kind of a risk-taking behavior, right? And so if you're a person who engages in a lot of risks, you're not going to have so much of a problem engaging in the risk of illegal drug use. You might not care as much or be worried so much about getting caught or the other problems that can ensue losing your job and things like that of drug use. Um, Antisocial personality disorder is also common among drug users, and there's often a lot of comorbidity, especially between mental health and drug use. You'll often see people with mental health issues as well as substance abuse problems, and so those things can kind of co-present. When you put people into treatment, then they have to treat both the mental health issue and the substance abuse issues, which can be a little bit more challenging obviously, than just having one. And then there's the neurochemical effects of stimulants, right? You can have emotional and behavioral symptoms that lead to violent behavior. Stimulants tend to make people a little bit more irritable, a little bit more excited. Some people can get paranoid. They can have a cognitive impairments or kind of intensify their emotional state, amphetamines can even cause psychotic symptoms. Um, so that's something to think about. This kind of psychopharmacological effects of stimulants, right? Other drugs and violence, hallucinogens, marijuana, stuff like that. That's not really so much related to violence, like I said. So the big takeaway and kind of the conclusion of this chapter, this lecture that we're going through now, is that drugs and crime and drug use are related. There is a relationship between the two. Whether it's causal, that's kind of unclear, right? Um, the illegal drug trade does lead to some violence, right? If you have chronic users who are from a lower socioeconomic status, that can lead to increases in property crime. Um, Stimulant use and violence is rather inconclusive, but there is a pretty good amount of evidence for that, with the exception of alcohol, which they do have pretty good conclusive evidence that alcohol can lead to increased violence. And the final part, which I think is probably the most important for thinking about why uh, we can't reach this conclusion for sure that drug use causes crime, is this idea of the causal relationship. We see the correlation that drugs and crime are correlated, but we don't know if drugs are causing crime is causing drugs, or some other factor is causing both the drugs and the crime. So there's a spurious effect there. We can't really rule these things out, and so it would be not a good idea to do so without the evidence, right? Um, so that's kind of the overview of the drugs and crime relationship, and probably brought up more questions than it did answer. But that's a good thing because you actually learned a lot and learned that it's probably not as simplistic as TV would have you believe, which is the case with many things within criminology. You will find that there's not really a simple go-to answer for everything or solution. Otherwise, the issue would have probably been solved a long time ago, and a lot of us would be out of work. So anyway, I wish you all to have a good week, and please let me know if you need anything. And please don't forget to read the chapter because they go into a little bit more depth than I have in the past little lecture here. So I'll talk to you all next time.